Hi there and welcome. My name is Gauthier Choquet and I am a Microsoft Technical Trainer. Welcome to the first module of our session, Migrate SQL Server Workloads to Azure SQL. In this video, we'll focus on designing a SQL Server migration strategy. We'll cover the phases of a migration, the steps involved, and the benefits of modernizing your data platform with Azure SQL. Transitioning SQL Server workload to the cloud can improve scalability, security, and performance. We will discuss how to assess your current environment, identify compatibility issues, and create a detailed migration plan tailored to your organization needs. Additionally, we will explore different tools and techniques to streamline the migration process and ensure minimal downtime and data integrity. An exciting component of this session is our hands-on approach. Throughout the sessions, you will have the opportunity to be engaged in real-world scenarios using database management systems like Azure SQL Database and SQL Server. These hands-on activities are designed to reinforce the theory, allowing you to apply what you have learned in a controlled environment. By actively participating in this exercise, you will gain a deeper understanding of the migration process, and by the end of our session, you will be equipped with the knowledge and the skills to successfully migrate your SQL Server workload to Azure SQL. And you will be able to get the full potential of our cloud-based data solution. Migrating SQL Server database to Azure SQL can bring multiple benefits to your organization, but it's important to identify any compatibility issues or potential blockers before attending a migration. Assessing a database helps validate the code and the schema of the source database to ensure compliance with the target platform. It detects any inconsistencies, issues, or features that are not supported, ensuring a smooth migration. The SQL migration roadmap consists of 5 different stages. Each stage includes important tasks required to complete a successful migration to Azure Cloud Services. The stages are, number 1, initiate and discover, where we can ask ourselves questions like, hey, what is the current state of our database, like the performance, its size, and the throughput. Number 2, assessment. We could ask questions, is it part of a larger application? Is the data being used by another application, looking for dependencies and more? Number 3, the planning phase, like asking questions like, are there multiple options to pick from, right? Because we have different targets that we can select from. And which one do we need? Stage number 4, transform and optimize. And then finally, step number 5, migrate, validate, and remediate. Understanding database footprint and potential approaches to the migration is critical for us. When evaluating the current state of our database, we can consider multiple components. What are the key performance indicators of our database? Are there any existing bottlenecks or lack of performance? How will these factors impact our migration strategies? Right, those are simple questions that we can ask ourselves. During the assessment phase, it is important to ask yourself, what dependencies does your database have within the larger application ecosystem of the organization? Are there any potential compatibility issues between the Azure SQL and the source and destination? What steps can you take to ensure data integrity and security during the transition? In the planning stage, some important questions include, what are the migration options available and which one align best with the organization needs? Also, question about the downtime. How will you minimize the downtime and disruption during the migration process? What resources and tools will be required to facilitate a smooth migration? By addressing those type of questions, you can develop a comprehensive migration strategy that ensures a seamless transition to Azure SQL, capitalizing on the benefits of the cloud technology. Assessing a database is a critical step in the migration process as it ensures a smooth and successful transition to Azure SQL. By conducting a thorough assessment, you can identify potential compatibility issues, inconsistencies, or unsupported features that could slow down the migration. This is a proactive approach that can help to validate the code and schema of the source database, ensuring compliance with the target platform. It also allows you to establish remediation steps and optimize the database for a new environment. Having an assessment helps to mitigate risk, minimize downtime, and maximize the benefits of the transitioning to Azure SQL, enhancing the overall business efficiency and the performance. When we think about a migration, the tooling will be important. As part of our session, we'll be using a subset of different tools for seamless assessment and migration. We'll be using the Azure SQL Data Studio with the Azure SQL Migration Extension. It provides a seamless experience for assessing and migrating SQL Server database, making the transition process efficient and straightforward. To use the extension, you can install the Azure Data Studio on your system, enabling you to access multiple tools for database management and migration. By adding the Azure SQL Migration Extension, you will be able to leverage Azure's recommendation and best practices for a successful database migration process. The migration extension conducts a thorough evaluation of the source SQL Server instance by running a series of rules to pinpoint potential issues that need to be addressed prior to the migration of your SQL Server database to Azure SQL. Please note that an Azure account is not necessarily required for the assessment or the SKU recommendation. These features allows the user to evaluate the readiness and cost estimates to migrate their database to Azure without the need of creating an Azure account. So what does that mean? Well, even if you're not sure if you want to migrate your workload to Azure, the tool will give you the readiness and the cost estimate prior to migration. Based on the performance of the data collected from your source SQL instance, whether it's on premises or coming from another cloud environment, the extension also offers recommendations around the compute and the storage configuration for your Azure SQL target. This features helps ensure that the Azure SQL target meets your workload requirement. While the Azure recommendation feature does not provide price estimate due to different nature of the pricing, you can combine the assessments with the Azure pricing calculator or generate a SQL assessment within the Azure Migrate tool to gather accurate pricing estimates. Those options enable you to make informed decisions by considering the specific pricing details relevant to your scenario and to your organization.
All right, so let's think about a situation for migration. And for that, we're going to ask the Copilot to help us to generate a scenario, right? So let's ask generate a scenario where Contoso for our organization, scenario where Contoso as an organization wants to migrate one of their applications including a SQL database to Azure. All right, perfect. Let's run this. Let's see what we get from it. I'm gonna let it run. Okay, perfect. Interesting, a very detailed scenario here. So I'm just gonna bring most likely the beginning of it, a background and an objective. Like that sounds like a good scenario. All right, so let's copy this. I'm gonna place it out on the whiteboard. Here you go. So let's leverage this as one of the example scenario for our whiteboard discussion. So scenario consists of migration to Azure. Background, Contoso is a leading retail company has decided to migrate one of their critical applications, including its SQL database, to Microsoft Azure. The application is currently hosted on premises and support the inventory management system. Okay. Also, we have the objective, improving scalability and performance, enhance security and compliance, reduce the cost, and enable better disaster recovery and high availability. Interestingly, those are all the points we're going to see as part of our session. Okay, so I mean, those are some of the benefits we can get through a migration. So actually, that brings to another good question we could ask ourselves, right? Which is, based on what we have for that scenario, why should I or should we consider to migrate my SQL database to Azure? Right? Nice little simple question here. I'm going to copy that question, and actually we're going to leverage one of the features here that we have available within the whiteboard as well. The Copilot on the whiteboard. So let's ask the same question out there. I'm going to provide you some suggestion. And let's see what we have before we start to discuss the different phases for the migration process. All right, so I'm going to add some categorization as part of it. And we're going to see, most likely, I see some keywords here that are interesting. Here you go. So some of those, I repeat the question that we placed out there. Why should I consider to migrate my SQL database to Azure? Potentially scalability and flexibility, security, enhanced security features. We're going to talk about those, cost efficiency, potentially, right? We're going to have different costs that's going to be driving based on the different options that we picked for our deployment for our database, integration, potentially with other services, or maybe with other application, depending on how we do it. Others, automatic backup and update. Those are managed solution that comes with some of those benefits that we're going to be discussing as well a little bit later throughout the session. And then high availability, right? So can we get some of those benefits? Well, the answer is yes. But before we go through this, we need to discuss the different phases of the migration process, right? Because what we do or what we want is essentially it is we have for this scenario, right? We have something on-prem. Okay, so think about, we're talking about the applications. I'm not going to go into the detail of what we have, but potentially you have some application on-prem. You know, maybe you have some VMs including as part of this application, right? VMs with an S, potentially multiple of them. Of course, we will have in our situation, we're going to have some databases as well. Database, right? Maybe we'll have some controller, some domain controller, and so on and so on. Right? Multiple components that we can have on-prem, just a subset of what we have here, like DCs, right? And else, and more, okay, depending on what we have on-prem. Now, the idea of a migration, what is it? Well, it is to take what we have on-prem and to place it, to migrate those components somewhere else, right? And then in our example, that somewhere else would be in Azure, right? So in Azure, what's interesting here is that we have multiple different type of component, right? So our migration journey consists of moving a resource from a source to a destination, where in my example, we're moving from the source, which is the on-premises location, to a destination, which is the Azure cloud. Okay, so we move the database to Azure. Here we're gonna see in an upcoming topic that we have different types of databases, okay? Also, as we have different types of resources available in Azure. For example, here I see at the bottom on-prem, right? That's what we have right there, on-prem premises. We have VMs, applications, and so on. So potentially, can I have some VMs on Azure? Well, yes, too, right? I'm keeping the discussion a little bit more generic on the application itself, right? And then we're gonna deep dive on the database on upcoming topics, right? So I'm just giving you the logic of a migration, and then we are going to apply this only as part of the migration of a database. So we can have some VMs, we can have some different resources. We can have some web apps, right? Containers, web apps. Okay, changing the icons here. Some containers, and then for us, and more, right? Many other resource type. But for us, our topic will be the database. Which type of database? Well, we are not there yet, right? But then we're going to talk about different type of databases in the upcoming module here. Now, what we want to think about is different approach, right? So there's different types of migration, and this is what we call right there with the 5 R's, right? So we have multiple type of migration. So what do we have? We have the first one, the rehost, right? The rehost, what it is? Well, it's a pure lift and shift, right? It's fairly easy. There's not much impact. So let's say if you have a VM on-prem, then you're migrating to a VM on Azure, right? We have the refactoring as part of migration. Refactoring, what it is? Well, there's at the application level, there's no change on the code, but you're looking more to have a PaaS, transitioning to a PaaS solution. And we're going to go back there as well in a few here, right? Next, we have the re-architect. Okay, so what does that mean here? Well, we need to maybe do some modification on the application, maybe doing some modification at the scope of the database as well here in order to optimize it for a cloud architect approach, right? So that's the number 3. Next, we have the rebuild. As the name says, we're gonna start again, right? You're starting a brand new life cycle for the application, and then you start a new life cycle of the application on the cloud, and then you're gonna create that application as a new one here, okay? And then next, we have lastly, we have the replace. We can think about going to a SaaS solution, okay? And we're gonna define those in a few as well. I know I'm using some acronyms there just to give you some generic concept here, but we're going to define those as well. So a good example for the replace migration could be maybe you have some SharePoint farm on-prem with some databases, and then you're migrating that on-prem SharePoint farm to a SharePoint Online solution, right? So very interesting to see the different types of migration. Now, is that the only consideration? Well, no, right? So other consideration could come, a good question to ask the organization is, how long do we have for that migration? Are we talking about a migration that has to happen within the end of the week, or do we have 6 months to do it, right? Because of the timing, if the timing is not the same, then potentially we can have different approach, right? Remember the rehosting and refactoring, those are the one we're going to focus for us within our session. And they're very interesting, like different approach that we can have based on those. Now we can ask the budget, right? Are we looking, what are the reasons for that migration? Do we want to reduce the cost? Do we want to look for innovation? Do we want to reduce the complexity of our database, right? So there's different type of triggers that will enable a migration discussion, right? Could be innovation trigger, but also could be some related to complexity, right? So I'm going to place a complexity as well here. Do we want to simplify the structure of the database here? Or do we want to optimize its operation, increase business agility here, right? So based on those here, it comes with different phases. Well, that's interesting, right? Based on what we just discussed, I'm going to call that one the phase 0, which is the discovery. Okay, so this is the first, the phase 0, first phase. So what we need to have is we need to have Contoso to conduct an audit of its existing environment to understand the data estate. Like, what do we have currently? So good question is, what do we have, right? So think about the different, if we have some in terms of performance, right? So what do we have currently? So that's the current state, the performance of the application, which is very interesting as well, because keeping track of performance is definitely something that we want to have. Think about it. So if we have the application right there on-prem, right? And it's database on-prem, so there's some dependencies between those two, right? So we can think about migrating the application itself with the application layer plus including the database, or the database first, migrating that database to the cloud here. So we will end up having that database being migrated to Azure, and that's going to come up with some difference between the performance. Okay, so having a clear state of what performance we have on-prem is very interesting, right? So when we think about performance, it's usually something we don't want to get something worse out of the migration. So based on the dependencies what we have on-prem for this specific example, we may decide to actually migrate the entire application as one, including the database, right? If we want to mitigate and optimize the performance. Because what if we just do this, right? Having the database on Azure and then the application layer on-prem, well, that will have an impact on performance, independently of which type of connection you have between your on-prem location and then your Azure subscription. That will have some impact as related to the performance here. Okay, so interesting to have in mind, to keep in mind the performance, but also, as mentioned, the dependencies, right? Dependencies. So is my application, what do I have within my application, right? Am I using other VMs, for example? Is the data being used by another application? If yes, we need to keep in mind that we need to keep that feed of data for the other applications, right? So kind of make sense as part of those. That's the phase 0, the discovery. Now let's think about the phase number 1. I'm just going to continue here. Phase 1, which is, as we just saw it, the assessment. Okay, so we can do what we call the grouping. Okay, so if we decide that, hey, those two applications, they need to be migrated together because we have high dependencies between those here, then that means we need to include that second application as part of our migration. We can also categorize the database servers and applications together, right? Also talk about a good question, can it be moved to the cloud? Right, it's a great question. And then I had to do multiple migration in the past when I was on the customer side here, and then not often, but sometimes happened that it actually didn't make any sense to move it to the cloud, right? So we get the business requirement coming from one side, and then actually getting other information that the application will be decommissioned a few months later. So is that worth the effort to do it? Well, potentially yes. I'm not saying that you have to say no to your database migration, but ask yourself the right question. Is the business requirement having the entire picture, or is it just a checklist on a file here just to move as many application to Azure here, right? So potentially, does it make sense to move it to the cloud? And then also, next we're going to talk about the right sizing, which is interesting here, right? The right sizing of our database, because on-prem, capacity is usually not an issue, right? So we can spin up a VM, having large VM potentially if we have some highly transactional application. The storage usually not an issue as well. But then what's going to happen in Azure? Can we keep the same sizing for that database? Well, potentially yes, right? Is that a good thing to do? Well, most likely no. Why? Because there's going to be an impact on the cost, right? So we want to make sure we have the right sizing, so the right mix of compute and the right mix of compute and storage with memory here. We're going to talk about this on the upcoming module, more about those and how they relate together here. Okay, so that's for our phase number 1. So we can continue with the phase number 2. Phase 2, which is the planning phase here. Okay, so in that phase, the planning phase outlines the target platform, right, with the migration approach that we want to have and think about the different interruption that we want to have. So that's at this point here. Remember, we talk about the different types of migration that we have out there: rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, and replace. So at this step, this is where we want to target the right migration for our use case here, right? So do we choose, we use a couple of acronyms here. We talked about the IaaS, right? If we want to build um, an Azure SQL database on a VM, right, with the infrastructure as a service, we talk about the PaaS, platform as a service, with that managed database that we have available to us here, right? So at this phase 2, for the planning phase, this is when we have to target one of the type of migration here based on that. Now, related to what we just discussed on the phase 1, we need to talk again about the right sizing. Okay, that's when we need to pick the size of our database. Now, very interesting, if we use those PaaS solution for our databases, then we have some type of flexibility, meaning is that it's fairly easy to change the size of our database if we want to add or remove a little bit of compute, or if we want to add or remove a little bit of storage here. Okay, those PaaS solutions are managed solutions that we have available in Azure, and then it's fairly easy to scale up or down the pool of resources that we have available. So interesting, so we can start small, thinking about the cost, right? We can, if we are at the beginning of the migration, which is what I'm going to do as part of some of the demos here, I'm going to deploy a very small database, right? I'm going to start with a very small data set. Do I need to have a large pool of compute and memory? Well, the answer is no, right? I can start small, and then over time, as our database is growing over time, then I can scale up and add more resources. Okay, more will come on this on the upcoming module as well. All right, so let's continue with our phase 3, which is that phase is ongoing, by the way. It is the transformation, and optimization. Optimization never stops. There's always room for improvement on our database. Very interesting. So we can think about, you know, the transformation that would be needed potentially to ensure compatibility with the new data platform. Okay, we can think about, you know, updating the stored procedure that we may have, the different queries to match the target platform syntax. Okay, we can think about the optimization, optimization of the databases, right, to leverage new features available in Azure. Because by transitioning to Azure, we get some new benefits, and then potentially here we can look and do the implementation of those features here. Okay, there's a lot that will be said that will be coming on upcoming modules as well. Now the phase 4, testing. Right, test, remediation, very important to test, right? So as part of the migration, you actually require to do some testing through the different approach that we have here. So, you know, with the tools, we're going to be using the tools, and we're going to do migrations together in a couple of demos actually. So the toolings that we're going to be using, it's a sequence of action, meaning you have multiple steps and you cannot go to step number 3 without completing the step number 2, right? So sequence of action with multiple testing as part of it. So there is some testing that will be done during migration, right? And then we will have also some post migration testing. Like what type of testing can we have post-migration? Well, functional testing, performance validation, making sure that the data is being consistent and that we can keep the integrity of that data here, okay? And then potentially that's what's gonna help us to optimize the migration journey, okay? So we see just from a simple example that we just got generated from the Copilot here, going back to that migration here scenario for Contoso, we have a comprehensive roadmap, right? So Contoso can effectively migrate its database to Azure by unlocking the benefits in terms of scalability, cost efficiency, security, and innovation. All right, so this journey not only enhances the Contoso's capabilities, but also position the organization for future growth and success. All right, so now let's go back to the presentation.
Now this is time for a demo. You can either watch me doing it or we can do it together. In this demo, you will assess the readiness of a legacy SQL Server database for migration to Azure SQL database. Your task is to identify any potential compatibility issues or changes needed before the migration. You will also review the database schema to identify unsupported features or configuration in Azure SQL database. So let's go ahead and get started.
All right, so welcome to our first demo where we're gonna assess an existing SQL Server database and look for its migration. So for that demo, I'm gonna be using multiple tools. I'm gonna be using the Azure Visual Studio Code. I'm gonna be using the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and then the Azure Data Studio for its assessment prior migration. Okay, and also what would be needed for this demo would be an existing data set. So I've been a little bit proactive on this one, and I already created a folder that I call DP-3001 with our sample data, right? So a database coming from AdventureWorks LT, where you have links on how to get this data, okay? So first, what we're gonna be doing is open the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So there's a couple of requirements here. So this one has to be at least on the version 18 based on this one. So once open, what we're going to be doing is that we'll connect to the server itself, right? So right here, I'm on the lab VM. So I'm leveraging this lab VM as my server. So I'm going to be connecting to it. All right. Now that we are connected, we can see that we have those system database, right? I don't have any database created yet, but this is actually going to be the intent, and this is what we're going to be doing right now. Okay. So let's go ahead and open a new query. The query is being provided as well here if you need it, or you can also look at my screen. So what we're going to be doing with that query, let me get it in front of us right there. So we have it. All right, so we're going to be restoring the database from the backup file, right? So remember, I have the folder that I created. I placed this backup file coming from the AdventureWorks LT 2019 backup here. And what I'm going to be doing here, it is updating the folder name here, right? So for me, I placed it on the DP-3001. Okay, so multiple location where we need to change the path here. All right, continue DP-3001, one more. So as we have seen before, a database is requiring two different files. So we have the MDF file and then the LDF file. So the MDF is for the data file, and then the LDF file is the log file as mentioned previously. Okay, once we have the query updated, well, let's go ahead and execute it. So what's going to be doing right now, so it should have created the database. So what we have done is that we restore from that backup file. All right, so let's go ahead, let's refresh it. And then as we can see here, we have our database. So database comes with multiple tables. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to select one of those tables and do some modification. So prior modification, let's have a look. We're going to select the top 1000 rows to have a look of what type of information we have for that specific table. So here I'm on the sales LT dot customer, and we can see a couple of information. So we have the name, first name, company name, and so on, and a modified date, right? So the intent here is that we are going to add an additional column. Okay, so on upcoming query, what I'm going to be doing here, new query. So right click on the database name, new query. That's what I've done. And what we're going to be doing out there is that we're going to create a query that's going to provide some modification. Okay, so we're going to add a column called next with that specific query that we have on the screen. Okay, so let's run it. All right, complete it. So let's see the modification. Always good to double check, right? So let's go ahead and refresh on the database name. And then what we're going to look at, so we can probably reuse that query out there. So run the query against this one. So now what we have, actually I need to refresh it first. Let's run it again. New query, refreshed that we have done. So I'm going to be going under the specific table here. Select the top 1000 rows as done previously. And then now we can see that the column we added, right? So we added column called next, and that column has no value. Okay, so it's very interesting. So it's a column that has no value. It's not that he has a zero value, right? It has no value. So potentially here we can think about, hey, would that be blocking for upcoming migration? Well, that's a great question. And this is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so now that we have the database with its table, let's look at how we can do the assessment for migration. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do, so I am going to open the Azure Data Studio, right? So there's been, first of all, you need to install it, the tool itself. And then next, what you need to have, very important, is that you need to have that Azure SQL Migration Extension. Okay, so if you have not done it yet, you have to install it, because without that, we will not be able to proceed for the assessment. Okay, so on my side, this is something I've done already. So I installed the tool itself plus the extension. Okay, so new connection that I'm going to do here. So connection type Microsoft SQL Server. Perfect. That's what I want. Now, the server name. How do you find it? Well, this is the information that you have right there. Okay, so for me, I'm going to be leveraging this server name as part of my connection through the Azure Data Studio. All right, so let's do it. SQL 1, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, then now a modification that we can do here on the all right, so looking here, encryption mandatory, so potentially we can change it to optional here. Trust server certificate, yeah, that's correct. We're going to continue here with those default value. Connect, I can see the green icon here, meaning that we are being connected here. Potentially we can, deep dive on those little components so we can see our database right there. We could look at the table as we did through the SQL Server Management Studio here. Okay, but remember, we are leveraging the other tool here, which is going to be for looking at the assessment for our database prior migration. Okay, so I'm going to go back right there, going to click on Manage on the server name, and then under Manage, you have that general Azure SQL Migration. This is where we want to be, and then we're going to prepare for migration. Okay, so remember, as part of the preparation steps, what we have here, we have the discovery and we have the assessment. So we're going to do both right here, right? So prior, in order to prepare for migration, you have the database for assessment. Okay, so we select which database we want to run for assessment. So in my situation, I have only one, my AdventureWorks LT. Okay, potentially if we had more than one, we could select the one that we want. We don't have to migrate or to assess all database at the same time. Okay, one at a time could work as well. Okay, let's continue. Now that we selected the database for the assessment, we can go to the next phase. Okay, so we can see the assessment is in progress. It's going to provide some SKU recommendation. So what can we expect? Well, as expected, as discussed previously, we can see we have that IaaS approach where we can do the migration to a SQL Server Azure Virtual Machine, right? IaaS, infrastructure as a service, or we have our PaaS solution on the left and in the middle. So platform as a service, we can see we have the Azure SQL Managed Instance and the Azure SQL Database. Okay, very interesting of what I look at is like, hey, readiness, we have that green check, which is good, but we can see that maybe the database itself or else is not ready. Okay, there's something blocking here. Is that good to proceed with something that is red flag or blocking prior the migration? Well, most likely not. Okay, and we can see we have this blocking issue here against the SQL database, the Azure SQL database as a target, and we don't have it as part of the Azure SQL Managed Instance. Okay, so good information depending on our target. So for instance, here we're gonna look at next what we have. So if I select the target type, remember the target type, it is where I want to do the migration. Okay, so if I look at first one, Azure SQL Database, I'm gonna say like, hey, there is some red flag here. So good advice, good recommendation, more than an advice, which is that recommendation. If you see something at this point which is flagged as not ready, pay attention. Right? Or even ready with warnings. So we want to potentially slow down and look at the reason why we have this. So actually, let's have a look here. So I'm selecting the database itself and the findings that it has, and then it say like, hey, that database with the table and that column next has no value, right? There's no value. I'm not going to read the entire error message here, but it says there's no value. So we need to set up a value for it here. Kind of makes sense, right? So I have a column that has no value. And then the Azure SQL database is flagging this as a warning prior to the migration. Okay, so that's the reason why we do those assessments. Now, what if I just change this from the Azure SQL database to the Azure SQL Managed Instance? Okay, do we have the same issue? Well, no. See, findings here as part of the Azure, the AdventureWorks LT has no findings, meaning that the database itself is ready for migration. Okay, so it's very interesting. So it's not because we had this warning as part of the Azure SQL database that we actually get it from the Azure SQL Managed Instance as well here. Okay, so just for instance, if I go back there, I remember Azure SQL database as a target type, we have that flag here as part of the database itself. Okay, so should we proceed to the migration with the Azure SQL database? Well, most likely not, right? We're going to do some modification as part of the source database in order to update this information out there. Could we go and continue on the migration to the Azure SQL Managed Instance? Well, in that situation, yes, potentially, because that warning is not being captured as part of that Azure SQL Managed Instance migration. Okay, so meaning that the Azure SQL Managed Instance will be able to handle that no value as part of that column. But the Azure SQL database itself is not. Okay, so that's why we need to do some modification. Also, as part of the assessment, what we can do is to save the assessment report. Okay, so I'm going to save it. Okay, potentially I'm going to place that on the download a file here. We have a folder, sorry. So we have the assessment that's being generated and created. So let me have a look at it. It's JSON format. So I'm gonna open it through the Visual Studio Code. And then here we have the output of the entire assessment. Okay, so we can see there's some warning here, potentially as part of the instance based on the authentication here. I didn't go through it. We focus on the database itself, right? Azure SQL database with the total number of database that was went for the assessment is 1, and we can see it here at the bottom that the value is flagged not ready. Okay, if we go down with the information here for the Azure SQL Managed Instance, number of database for that one is still 1, right? We only have 1, and we can see at the bottom, line 96, that recommendation status is ready, meaning that the application, the database, sorry, is ready for migration with the SQL Migration Instance. But it's not for the Azure SQL database, which is, let's say, what we want to do for that example. So what do we need to do? Well, let's go back. We need to do some modification as part of that specific column, right? So we have the null as part of the next column. So what do we want to do here? Well, what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to create a new query for this one, and we're going to do a modification as part of that column. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing right here is that I'm going to be dropping the column next. So if the column is not there, doesn't matter if we have no value in it because the column itself will not be there. So is that what we want? Well, potentially yes. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm going to be refreshing. So we dropped it. So do we expect to have the information as part of the table? Let's see it. So that's the table we want to see. Select top 1000 rows. Let's scroll to the right. And then now the next column is not here anymore. Okay, so let's go back to our Azure Data Studio. Okay, I'm gonna go to the previous step, run the assessment again. You can see it here. I can click on refresh the assessment. So it's very interesting because while we are fixing potentially some warning out there, you don't have to recreate the assessment from scratch here. You can just go back to the previous step, refresh the assessment, and then here you go. So now we can see that we have the green light for all of it. Okay, there is no blocker for our Azure SQL database. Does that sound interesting? Well, potentially yes, right? So let's go see it. Okay, we can see Azure SQL database as a target type. Okay, now we don't have that blocking situation, and then now our database is ready to migrate. Okay, so very interesting demo here because we have learned on how to assess the readiness of a SQL Server database for migration to an Azure SQL database here. Okay, so potentially it can be having some compatibility issue. Okay, and as we just had, and we have done the necessary steps here to mitigate that issue. Okay, that potentially we could have through the migration. So those tools here are very interesting. The Azure Data Studio for migration here, for SQL migration, very interesting because if there's some warnings, this is going to tell you proactively. Okay, so as mentioned, a good recommendation here is if there is some issue, might as well check them as early as possible before that arise in future steps within the migration. And the tool here is very good at providing this information here. All right, perfect. I hope you enjoyed this first demo. We're gonna have more demos upcoming here, and then keep learning, and we have upcoming topic here within our session. All right, so hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
In this module, we have explored the phases of a SQL Server migration strategies and then the steps involved to ensure a smooth execution of your migration project. We looked at data platform modernization and the different benefits it can bring to your organization. The key takeaways include understanding the different stages of data migration, recognizing the importance of assessing and planning, and also appreciating the values of leveraging the Azure robust data platform technologies. By now, you should have a clear understanding on how to design a SQL Server migration strategy that aligns with your organization goals and optimize your data management processes. The knowledge gained in this module will empower you to make informed decisions and make effective migration strategies. Thank you for watching and keep applying this concept to ensure a successful database migration journey.